Welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
On this episode, a citizen's guide to resistance.
Nobody's coming to rescue you. That's just not going to happen. If the people you're reading about in your newspaper are getting it wrong, just saying so doesn't achieve anything. Get out there and make them do it right.
Our guest is journalist and author Timothy Noah, who's currently a staff writer at the New Republic. He's also a longtime contributor to the Washington Monthly. We spoke to him about his recent piece on what ordinary citizens can do to make their voices heard in a tumultuous time. Hey, Tim, it's great to have you with us.
It's delightful to be here, Anne.
So we're having this conversation shortly after a nationwide wave of protests against Donald Trump's policies. The organizers of the so-called hands-off protests claimed millions of participants, including around the world. And if you saw the photos online, there were pretty big crowds, even in red places like Idaho, Missouri. Your piece, Tim, is titled A Citizen's Guide to Resistance, and one of your exhortations is to march. So
Yes.
Let's start there. Why is it so important to march? What did you find from history about the effectiveness of these kinds of protests? And are these protests we're seeing last weekend, are they, as they say, a moment or a movement?
I think they're a movement. I think we've seen quite a lot of mobilization since Trump entered the White House for a second time. And there was a study that showed we've seen, more than twice as many protests, for example, in the month of February this year than in February 2017. We're seeing a lot of response by a lot of people, and that gets the message through, not so much to Trump, because I don't think it's possible to get a message through to Trump, but it does get a message through to others in power, particularly Republicans, and that's important. Republicans, have to learn that they have something to lose in their blind support of Trump.
Now, in your piece, you talked about the effectiveness of these kinds of protests over time. So if you could talk a little bit about what you discovered in the course of your reporting about the central role that marching, the protests can play.
Well, you had, the classic example is the Civil Rights March, which followed a period of litigation leading up to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And here you have something slightly different happening. You have the litigation and the protesting going on at the same time. And they're, I think, mutually reinforcing in a good way. Now, we haven't seen a lot in the way of results yet because these decisions move through the courts slowly, and Garrett can explain that better than I can. But we are making progress. We are seeing decisions. Trump is losing most of these cases, and he's losing to a lot of Republican-appointed judges. He's even losing to some Trump-appointed judges. And that's progress.
Well, one of the things about what has happened this time around instead of last time is that last time we had the huge People's March in Washington, D.C. We've had protests the figure I've seen is 1,200 different protests, including in a lot of red states. But one of the worrying trends is that red state legislatures are trying to really crack down on the right to protest. What do we need to do about that? Have you given any thought to it?
I think that one way or another, and this is a tough thing to say, but we're going to have to see people going to jail. We're going to have to see protesters going to jail. I most especially think we're going to have to see government officials go to jail. We've gotten close to that a couple of times where U.S. Marshals have had to come in and escort fired government officials out of their offices. But if one of those officials says, I'm not leaving, and ends up in jail, that will become a huge story because because a lot of these firings are illegal. And if somebody, particularly if some government official has a strong legal case that he can't be fired, by the procedures that Trump is following, then you will have the courts rushing to catch up with justice as some government official sits in jail, which is very much like the civil rights protests.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You had the United States Institute of Peace, where they study protest movements like this. You saw them uh, trying to some extent to resist efforts to shut them down. They're not even a government agency. They're a nonprofit
Yeah,
that's funded by the
Right.
government.
yeah.
And you saw them engaging in various tactical maneuvers to avoid shutdown. But I think someone's going to have to decide, I'm going to be Martin Luther King, I am going to go to jail. And it will probably take multiple people, because during the civil rights movement, it wasn't just Martin Luther King who went to jail. It's going to come to that, particularly if we see continued efforts by the Trump administration to resist court orders.
Yeah. I had a follow-up question on tactics. It was kind of interesting that Indivisible and other organizations decided to go with the 1,200, 1,300 local protest strategy rather than the one massive march in Washington. As a practical matter, what do you recommend as a tactic if you, as a citizen, want to get out there and march? As far as optics, effectiveness, is this new strategy of smaller local marches more effective, you think, than the great big one in DC? What should we be doing as citizens to have the most impact?
Well, I think we should be doing both, and I think it's easy enough to do both. But the local protests are more important, I think, because
Hmm.
um, this is the way pressure works in a democratic system. You exert pressure on local officials who are closer to the ground, and they in turn exert pressure upwards. And eventually it reaches members of Congress who will uh, be willing, finally, will become more scared of the possibility of losing an election than of angering Donald Trump. Uh, Now, right now, we're seeing this extraordinary situation where you're seeing rapid mobilization on Wall Street because Trump is in the process of destroying the economy. But over the long term, Wall Street is not going to save us. They have a shot at saving the stock market, but they're not going to save the
Right,
country.
right. Well, your piece lists three other strategies for citizen resistance. So let's just continue to take the rest of them in turn. And one strategy you list is, quote, sue the bastard. Uh,
Right, right.
so the,
That is the first line of defense, and it's the most effective, but it takes a long time. And we've seen, as I say, a lot of successful lawsuits, but they take a while to play out. The Trump administration plays games. When it receives an injunction, it interprets it in some ridiculous way, and then there has to be another court hearing, and so on. We are rapidly approaching a point. Garrett, I defer to you on this. We may have already surpassed it, where the Trump administration is not just defying the courts, but saying it's defying the courts. And at that point, we're going to, find out how far the courts are willing to go. And I think they're willing to go quite far. I think that the judges will be willing to assess fines on government officials. I think they'll be willing to put government officials in jail if they defy court orders. You may then see Trump step in and pardon those officials, or you may see him step in and order the Marshals Service to not do what the judge tells them. But each one of those steps escalates things to a increasingly uncomfortable level, and if nothing else, will cause the markets, which are already in terrible shape, to go berserk, because the United States economy is very dependent on projecting on a stable government, and if the government is not projecting that sense of stability, that creates economic.
Um, well, it's important to remember, I just want to throw this in, that the very first pardon Trump issued in his first term was to Sheriff Arpaio, who had been convicted by a district court of criminal contempt. So
Right.
I've always thought that that sent quite a message that the people working for Trump probably know about. But uh, another strategy you suggest is pester local elected officials. Uh, how do we do that? What is the meaning of that? How is it going to be effective? Which officials should people? There are people out there all over the country. Which officials should they look at? And do you just mean in red states or across the board?
Uh, well, I think the need is more urgent in red states because I think the blue states are already on board. But yeah, pester your city councilman, pester your state legislator, um, and the things you will likely pester those people about are not abstractions like uh, Trump's violation of separation of powers. It'll be over things like where's my social security check, where's my
Mhm.
um, uh, uh, research grant, where's my whatever government benefit or government fulfillment of government contract is being held up by the Trump administration.
We all get those emails. Click here to send a letter to your congressman, and it's a form letter, and you'll probably get a form letter back. Can it be as simple as that? Do Congress people, you think, pay attention to even the form letters that people are sending, especially if it's in large enough volume?
I think they yes, I think they pay attention. It's not enough. It's far from sufficient, but it does have some effect. I think we've seen some members of Congress already start to get nervous about, for example, the cutoff of grants under the IRA to build alternative energy. Uh, those were mostly going to red states, and it's not terrific when you're a Republican member of Congress and you're publicly in favor of denying your own state funds that have already been appropriated by Congress.
Well, the fourth and final suggestion you have in your piece is to keep up. And I think this is hard for a lot of people to do, in part because of the onslaught of news, but also because it really has been very demoralizing to see so much bad news all the time. But you suggest some strategies for managing that. You have some specific advice for specific sites that people should be tuning into and people to follow, and how to kind of triage the onslaught of news that's coming at us. Can you summarize some of that advice and what you recommend?
Yes, well, first of all, I strongly urge people not to cancel their newspaper subscriptions, any newspaper subscriptions. And I know that newspapers are imperfect institutions, some of them getting more imperfect by the day, but they're still the best we've got. And so you shouldn't cancel your subscription to the New York Times in a rage that it isn't left wing enough. You shouldn't cancel your subscription to the Washington Post because the owner has done a couple of very dumb things, like refusing to endorse Kamala Harris and coming out with some bizarre strategy to uh, uh, propagandize for free markets. And just a word there. I used to work. I used to be a news reporter in the Washington bureau of the Wall Street Journal, so I have a little experience with dealing with an institution that is a great news source that has a terrible editorial page, and we coped with it as reporters. Somebody my particular strategy was I just stopped reading the editorial page so that when a source said, "What did you think about that editorial?" I would say, "Gee, I don't know what it said." Um, uh, the these however compromised these news sources are, they're the best we've got. They are, just in terms of manpower, they are sending reporters out to gather information about important things, and they follow basic rules that guarantee a certain level of reliability. Um, the other thing that surprised me when I was talking to people, and really everything that I wrote in this piece was something that I learned from someone else. I knew nothing about protest before I started this piece. But a couple of people said you have to be on TikTok. Now I confess
Mm.
I started a TikTok account and it did not have a great success with it because I have absolutely no patience with it. But uh, there are reliable news sources here and there on TikTok. And The son of Lev Parnas, Aaron Parnas, turns out to be a pretty good source on what's happening in the legal realm. Lev Parnas was a guy who went to jail. He was an associate of Trump's who went to jail for him. But Aaron is a actually, he doesn't consider himself a member of the resistance, which is interesting. When I thought he would be when I talked to him, but he's a very just the facts man kind of guy. He sounded to me like Edward R.
Mm.
Murrow, and he said, I don't do commentary. I just tell you what's happening. And I talked to at least one lawyer who said, this is how I find out what's going on in the legal realm with regard to Trump is Aaron Parnas's TikTok and his Substack.
Well, I took your advice and signed up for TikTok, and I have learned some killer dance moves when we get together. That's just a little extra, a little bonus. One thing that I think is a very serious and is kind of brooding over this whole thing is the evolving role of immigration and customs enforcement as a kind of secret police that is grabbing people off the street, taking them, holding them incommunicados, shipping them to El Salvador, we've seen this directed against American citizens who are either wrongly swept up or who ICE tries to intimidate. Um, how do we? What do your sources say we tackle that? This fear, this attempt to spread fear, and to what extent should the resistance, focus on the problem of immigrant people being treated as subhuman?
Right, right. Well, I am embarrassed to say that after I wrote and published the piece, I realized that I had not talked much about immigration in the piece, and that the activists and scholars and politicians I talked to also did not talk much about immigration.
Mm.
And I think there's a reason for that, which is it's the hardest area. I should probably do a whole separate piece just on this because it's more difficult. Trump has a great deal of latitude in what he can do, and there are legal challenges that can be made, particularly First Amendment challenges on some of these, some of what's going on, some of the actions being taken against Ivy League colleges. But it's hard. It's very hard. The courts can be of some use, but only some use. And here, I think probably the role of protest is going to be important. And I think there's probably a role here for civil disobedience in protecting immigrants. And I am truly not an experience in that area. But when your government is doing something that is morally wrong, then it's time to break the law.
If I can just throw in, because I think you're absolutely on the right track with this, from my work on the Civil War era, it's amazing to look back and see what a galvanic effect the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had on Northern public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Because suddenly
Mm-hmm.
slave catchers from the South were coming into New York, they were coming into Milwaukee and grabbing people who, people knew, free Black people who were living and trying to shuffle them off to slavery. And there were some amazing civil disobediences. Boston City Hall was surrounded so that they could not bring a fugitive slave out and put them on a ship.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the problems is, once you sell that these are people in our community, it could be that exactly what you're talking about would ensue.
Mm-hmm.
Really important protest that not simply achieves registering dissent, but also mobilizes people who hadn't thought about this issue much.
And one group I didn't talk to, and I probably would have heard more about immigration if I did, was religious leaders. And religious leaders, I presume, played a big role in what you're talking about during the Civil War.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
They have this tradition of sanctuary, and but it's difficult. It is very hard. It's the most frightening part of the of what Trump is doing, because there is the least recourse.
Tim, one of the things I really loved about your piece was the historical context in which you grounded the practical advice that you're giving to Americans today. And you delve into a couple stories of successful citizen warriors. And one of them you mentioned is Lottie Sharfman, whom I actually did not know anything about.
I didn't either, I'm embarrassed to say, yeah.
If you could tell us about her story and why you thought that that was a particularly fitting example
I had never heard
of someone
of her
who could
either.
make a change.
I found out about her because I wanted to know who had said democracy is not a spectator sport, which is a cliche, but also a truism. And I wanted to lead my article with that sentiment, because I am frustrated that a lot of people I know do treat it as do approach politics in a passive way, and they express dismay and they express a feeling of hopelessness, and that's just not appropriate in a democracy. And so anyway, I did a little digging and found out it was that the person who said it was Lottie Sharfman, and she was a refugee from Germany, I think it was, Austria, Nazi-occupied Austria. Came to the United States, and she ended up running the League of Women Voters in the state of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts had a problem that a political scientist would tell you is insoluble. The problem was that the lower house in the state legislature was bloated. There were, more members than in the lower house in California, which has a much bigger population. And the state government in Massachusetts in those days, the 70s, was quite corrupt. And she took it upon herself to shrink the size of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And a political scientist would say you can't, because you would have to get the House of Representatives to agree to shrink itself and to give up some power and to eliminate some of its own jobs. That can't be done. And it was not done in her lifetime. She died in the middle of this political fight, but at quite a young age, actually. But she pushed this hard, and she said democracy is not a spectator sport. And there was a vote in the House. And yes, on the first vote, it was voted down. But that following election day, many of the people who had been most vociferous in their opposition lost their seats. And as a consequence, within a few years, to only think 3 or 4 years, you saw the House and the Massachusetts House and the Massachusetts Senate vote for this. You saw it approved in a state referendum, and today the Massachusetts House is a much smaller size than it was before Lottie Sharfman came along.
Wow.
Tim, I think a lot of people are talking about your piece, and it's because you did this newspaper journalist tactic of actually talking to people and asking them what
it's
they
a
knew
remarkable
and what they
technique,
thought.
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I missed that class. I don't, I just sit.
No,
think
but
whatever I
you're
think.
quite right. This is much more like a newspaper piece than a
Yeah.
magazine piece, and I did that on purpose.
So I'm wondering if somebody put you up against a wall and said, "What's the one thing that you learned doing this reporting that people need to be aware of?" I mean, obviously there's a lot, and people who haven't read the article go out and read it right away. But what's the one thing that you come away with that you think people need to know?
Um, it's hard to focus on just one, but I think several people said to me, nobody's coming to rescue you. Um, uh, that's just not going to happen. Um, and from that, I have extrapolated in my own mind a feeling that it is not especially fruitful for Democrats to engage in their favorite pastime, which is beating up on fellow Democrats and how they're getting this wrong. Um, the Rather than look to Democratic leaders and express frustration that they're not getting it right, uh, the opposition, the resistance, should be finding new leaders. Some of them will be in Congress. Some of them have already emerged. Jamie Raskin, I think, is a very significant leader of the resistance. There are a few others in Congress. Chuck Schumer is not, but that's fine. He's the minority leader in the Senate. He will or will not get reelected. But let's don't sit around waiting for Chuck Schumer to get it right. We should follow other people who are getting it right. And some of them will be in Congress. I think most of them will not. I think they'll be outside of Washington, and some of them outside of politics altogether. These are moments that create leaders organically. And I just think the kind of theater critic approach to politics, which our mentor Charlie Peters was always very exasperated by, is wildly inappropriate right now. If the people you're reading about in your newspaper are getting it wrong, just saying so doesn't achieve anything. Get out there and make them do it right.
Well, Tim, we will see you at the next protest.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.